I'm Stephen Bartkus, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our special presentation with Mike Allen this evening to commemorate the 247th anniversary of the Battle of Ridgefield. I'd also like to thank our friends here at St. Stephen's Church for allowing us to use this space for tonight's gathering. The Ridgefield Historical Society is located in the 1714 Scott House on Sunset Lane, and we have a collection of over 10,000 Ridgefield artifacts. And we're an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the entire history of Ridgefield, from the indigenous people who lived here thousands of years ago, all the way up to the present day. I invite all of you to get involved in our organization by becoming members, volunteers, and donors. Some of our upcoming events include the Battle of Ridgefield walking tours this Saturday, a self-guided tour of the cemetery focusing on flu epidemic victims from 1918 on May 4th, the Ridgefield History Club remembering our veterans on May 21st, the Peter Parley Schoolhouse season opening day on May 26th, we'll be in the Memorial Day Parade on May 27th, and Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni returns for a talk about his book with a presentation, Hiking Archaeological Ruins in Southern New England, on July 10th. You can learn more all about these upcoming programs by visiting our website, ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org. We also have many exciting projects underway that I'd like to briefly mention related to tonight's topic. United States Senator Richard Blumenthal recently announced the start of Phase 2 of our Battle of Ridgefield archaeology project, supported by a generous grant from the National Park Service to research and preserve the history of the battle through archaeological investigations. If you own a property in Ridgefield that you'd like us to consider for the study, please contact us. We are also spearheading the forensic studies at laboratories across the country of the Revolutionary War era skeletal remains found in a mass grave on Main Street. This includes cutting-edge genetic genealogy to try to identify and ultimately honor them. Due to a generous grant that we secured from the State Historic Preservation Office, morphological analysis of the skeletal remains, identification of trauma, radiography, micro-CT scans of the teeth, and analysis of dental pathologies are currently underway. Please join our email list to receive more updates about these exciting projects. For tonight, we are honored to have Mike Allen with us. He is a noted storyteller who specializes in bringing local history to life through his background in journalism, radio broadcasting, podcasting, and public speaking. He's the host of the popular podcast on Connecticut history, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The podcast is currently ranked by industry leader Patriot as being among the top 10% worldwide, currently with 140 episodes and over 200,000 downloads. You can hear a new 20-minute episode every Thursday at amazingtalesct.com, and you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For 10 years, Mike was also the news director at radio station I-95 FM in Brookfield before becoming press secretary to the mayor of Danbury. He subsequently spent 25 years working, living, and traveling internationally in a corporate career in which he specialized in communications and marketing. Mike has lived in Connecticut for more than 50 years, and he currently resides nearby in Danbury. Please join me in welcoming Mike Allen to Ridgefield.
Stephen, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out tonight. One of the things I want to admit right up front is when I hear that I've lived here for 50 plus years, I look in the mirror and say, is that really me that old? But yeah, it's been great because I love Connecticut. And I love the ability to do the podcast and be able to talk about all the local history that has occurred here. And while I cannot claim to be a Ridgefield native, I will have two claims to fame about Ridgefield. Number one, I did live in Casagmo for a year when I was working at I-95, so I have a little sincerity there. The other thing is that for you true local history buffs, where I live in Danbury used to be part of Ridgefield. It's all right. So there's a little sliver that went up there by the New York border that finally somehow got into Danbury's hands, but I live in that sliver. So I still consider myself part of Ridgefield in many ways. It's a beautiful town. I love this town. In fact, driving down here tonight, I drove the route that the British came from Danbury, down the back roads, Route 116, and through to Court Trail area, and it never ceases to amaze me how magical it is to drive and realize this is where this happened. This is where the local history occurred. I love this topic more than most topics that I talk about because not only is this a critically important event in history for Ridgefield, but I'm going to argue tonight that it was an extremely important battle in the overall Revolutionary War. And I'm going to give you one example. So yeah, I do this podcast, and about a month ago I did an episode, you may have heard it, the Battle of Groton Heights. Now this is where Benedict Arnold, who's up there on the left, Benedict Arnold was fighting for the Patriots when he was in Ridgefield at the battle. And he was good. He's a great general. I mean, he's fabulous. Nobody would ever dispute that. But then he went over to the British side, became a traitor, and all those horrible things. And his last major outing was the Battle of Groton Heights. Now, for those of you not familiar with the lay of the land out there, so we have the Connecticut River that goes up through essentially the middle of the state, and then there's the Thames River that goes up from New London and Groton and goes inland. 8 miles north of where that river comes into Long Island Sound is the town of Norwich. That's where Benedict Arnold was born. So for him to lead this raid was incredible. He burned down the then town of New London, but something like 300, 400 structures burned. Then Fort Griswold, up on the hill in Groton, they attacked that. 1,600 British soldiers, 160 Patriots. Virtually all the Patriots were killed, even after the truce flag went up. So it was a horrible situation. Now here I am doing an interview with the president of the Friends of Fort Griswold. So very plugged in to the Revolutionary War, I would have assumed. And she made a comment, she goes, and of course it was the only major battle in the Revolutionary War in Connecticut. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. We gotta stop you there, sorry. Have you ever heard of the Battle of Ridgefield? And she said, yeah, I kind of heard about that, but I don't know anything about it. And friends, I would argue that that's one of the biggest problems, is people just don't know what happened here. The other thing we're gonna talk about tonight, and I see, hopefully everybody will get into a sports analogy for a second. We all know about the notion of a team is down and out, right? It's down, it's late in the game, and then suddenly somebody on the bench says, let's go get them. And something happens, and the whole momentum of the game changes. And you can feel it. You can see, you can say, look, they're making baskets, they're kicking goals, they're doing these things. They weren't doing this 10 minutes ago. What happened? Well, when you look at the Revolutionary War, we're going to just take a little quick stroll through history to remind you where we had been. And the pendulum was shifting back and forth between the British having sort of the momentum and the Patriots having the momentum. And George Washington was having trouble getting recruits. So the long and the short of this is, if the Battle of Ridgefield had not been what it was, it would have sent a very horrible signal that could have meant the Patriots were not going to win this war. So I would argue to you that this is the true significance of the Battle of Ridgefield. But we'll get into that in just a second. Now I'm going to wander a little bit because I know I'm blocking some people right here and probably back there from seeing the slides. So I'm going to go on to remote. And hopefully this works too. It does. Eureka. Okay. What we're going to do tonight, and maybe I'm not going to do this. Hang on a second. 2 seconds, please. A slight technical difficulty. We will get it taken care of, I guarantee you that. We are back in business. I thank you for your patience. Okay. What we're going to do starting off tonight is talk about the historical context, because again, I think when you realize what had been going on in the Revolutionary War by the time the Battle of Ridgefield occurred, I think you will agree with me, this was the reason why it was so significant. Why were the British here? Why were they coming into Connecticut? Why were they going to Danbury to take out the supply depot? It was not as simple as just taking out the supply depot. We'll talk about that strategy. Then we'll actually follow the actual march, right? So they landed in where Westport is today. Westport didn't exist back then, so it was Norwalk bumping into Fairfield, with the Saugatuck River being the dividing line between them. After that, the Battle of Ridgefield. And after that, even, the skirmish at Saugatuck, which, frankly, there's still more to be learned about exactly what happened at Saugatuck. It's kind of a footnote in history right now, but there are a lot of people working on that as we speak. And then I'd like to just kind of wrap it up with a little epilogue at the end. When we talk about the weekend of the British coming, April 24th, today is April 24th. It was 247 years ago, this evening, that the British launched 26 ships out of New York City, went through Hell's Gate, out into Long Island Sound, and then they were going to go and land in what is today Westport. Took them virtually 24 hours to get there. They got there late Friday night. They disembarked, went inland. They camped at Weston. You're getting the very brief summary version right now. Then on Saturday, they go up through Reading, Bethel, and into Danbury. The original plan was that they were going to go to Danbury, take the Sabbath off on Sunday, and Monday do their mission, and then they were going to turn around and go back the way they came, which was essentially Route 58 Black Rock Turnpike, if you know it. Well, what happened was, and the biggest mistake the British made, was they were arrogant. They assumed that there was so much Tory support around that they were just going to roll out the red carpet for them and lead them right up to Danbury, let them do whatever they wanted, and then they could get out of town. They were not expecting the kind of reception they got. And as a result, they didn't bring as much ammunition as they should have brought. So they decide they have to go the back way out of town because there's so many soldiers at this point on the Patriot side massed up in Bethel. So they decide to go through Ridgefield. They come down, that's where the battle was held. They spent the night in Ridgefield. We'll show you where. I have a lot of pictures tonight, by the way, to show you where this actually happened. And then the next day, it was going to be, let's head back to Compo Beach in Westport, get on our boats, and go back to New York. So that was the grand scheme of things. Okay, so that's, when we talk about the weekend, that's what we're talking about. Here now is the historical context, and this is not a huge history lesson, but just some, you'll recognize all the names of the battles and everything, but going back to 1775, you'll see red ovals and blue ovals, British red, Patriots blue, and the British had Boston. They had had the Boston Massacre, they'd had the Boston Tea Party, all these things, but still the British controlled Boston until one day the British went inland to take out a depot of ammunition, and the Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy battle took place. And actually more people were killed in Menotomy than were in Concord and Lexington, but it was a big battle. The Patriots won it. So this was a big, significant start to the Revolutionary War. The shot heard around the world. This is it. This is when it started. 3 months later, there's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, even though the British are said to have won it because they didn't have to lose their position, they lost more soldiers. They lost a third more soldiers than the Patriots did fighting that battle. Then we go over to Fort Ticonderoga on the Hudson River. The Patriots win there. They grab the cannons, drag them across New England in the winter, through the snow. It was horrible, horrible conditions. But they got those cannons to a place south of Boston called Dorchester. And Dorchester's up on a hill overlooking Boston. And in March of 1776, Dorchester Heights, they shoot the cannons down, and suddenly the oval turns from red to blue. The British vacate Boston. At this point, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia had already hired George Washington, and Washington had come up through Connecticut and had gone up to get all of the warring factions on the Patriot side organized into an army. So this was a big celebration and a big win for Washington. And he goes immediately and says, we're going to go down and make sure that New York City is defended. Well, at this point now, the Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia in July of 1776, and the King of England is getting pretty upset because he sees it getting out of control. And he says to General Howe, who's in charge of all of the forces for the British in North America, put down this uprising, get these people out of here and get them under control. So what he does is he takes the much superior army, or navy of the British fleet, brings it into New York, and we have the Battle of Long Island, where Washington's forces are now pushed back. They lose, they go into Manhattan, they're pushed out of Manhattan, and they end up eventually in White Plains. They cross the Hudson River at White Plains, they go down through New Jersey and end up in Pennsylvania. So now you talk about this pendulum shift, right? Going back and forth, back and forth. This is when Washington now is really in need of a win. And what happened on Christmas Day, 1776? They crossed the Delaware River, the famous, Washington on his boat, and they surprised 200 Hessian soldiers in Trenton, took them, went on to Princeton from there. And then at this point, winter was really taking hold, so they had to go up to Morristown and camp out there. So now the question is, what are the British going to do about this? So the momentum now swinging a little bit back toward the Patriots. And it could go either way. So what the British strategy was at this point was to say, we know George Washington and his troops are there in Morristown. We also know that he put some troops up the river in Newburgh. And we know that this town in Connecticut called Danbury is supplying stuff to Newburgh. Connecticut was the provision state during the Revolutionary War. It provided food, uniforms, tents, all sorts of things that the army needed. And so they knew this, the British knew this, they had spies, they had scouts, they knew what was going on. And in fact, by the way, if you take 84 out to the Beacon-Newburgh Bridge, everybody know where that is? Yeah, okay. If you get off in Beacon before you go over the bridge and go down to the shoreline, you'll find a ferry boat, same route that they used to take across to bring the provisions over to Newburgh. And the Newburgh location where Washington had extra forces is preserved over in Newburgh, so you can see that if you want. So now everybody's saying, is this what's going to happen? Is Howe going to send his superior navy up the Hudson River and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies? So goodbye, provision state. You're not providing anything to anybody. We're going to control the waterway. Or are we going to cut off the head of the fish? We've got this Continental Congress down in Philadelphia. Why don't we just go down there and take them out? So people are on tinderboxes now. It's, starting to come out of the winter of 1776. Washington had this, very dramatic Delaware River crossing, and was waiting, and what's going to be the next step now? We get to the spring of 1777, 247 years ago this year. And the lay of the land is this, and what Howe does is he sends the boats up the Hudson River. He goes to Peekskill, and he attacks Peekskill in early spring of 1777. Burns houses, takes prisoners, takes supplies, ransacks the place. So now all the soldiers for the Patriots in Westchester County, Fairfield County, they're all starting to say, we need to start moving over toward the river because this is where he's going. It's pretty clear. A month later, what does he do? On this very day, 247 years ago, he sends another fleet up to Dobbs Ferry. And by the way, he was leaving boats behind when he did this, which was sending the signal to everybody, well, this is obviously what he's doing. He's building up the fortress. So he's got this, more and more troops are headed this way. It was actually a brilliant strategy, in large part because he kept it so secret. Only the very upper echelon of the British troops knew what was really going to happen, and that was they were going to go into Danbury instead, because they pulled everybody away over toward the river, and now they figured they were just going to waltz into Danbury and take it over. So this was the basic strategy. So what did it look like? Well, we already know that it started this very night. Now, this is the other thing. I don't know if you picked this up on the last slide, but Dobbs Ferry occurred on April 24th. The ships left New York for Danbury on April 24th. This is how brilliant it was. So in the morning, the Dobbs Ferry attack happens. That night, he sends out the 26 warships the other way. And by Friday morning now, scouts in Greenwich, Norwalk, Stamford, that area, are starting to see this flotilla coming up the Long Island Sound, but they're not sure where he's going. And when we say he, this is the time to introduce Mr. Tryon. William Tryon was at one point the British governor of North Carolina, and there were very few people who were as much of a scoundrel as he was in terms of just being nasty. Now, we had the Boston Massacre where 5, I think it was, Boston residents were gunned down. In North Carolina, we had the whole taxation without representation. The farmers were taxed, and now the British were coming around saying, I need a cow. And so, but you already have, we need a cow. And they were doing this routinely. And the farmers got very angry. And there was an uprising, and Tryon put it down very quickly. He went out and sent his men out, and they found the 5 ringleaders and hanged them that afternoon. No trial, no way to defend themselves, just hanged them. That little story spread throughout the colonies. And Howe, of course, knew about it. So Howe brings Tryon up to New York, figuring if I've got to keep this under control, I need a guy like him to help me out. So now he makes Tryon the governor of New York and says, oh, by the way, I want you to go up to Danbury. And there are 3 reasons why we're going to do this mission. Number 1, we're going to put Danbury out of commission as a supply depot. Number 2, we're going to take all the wagons from the people there and put all these supplies on those wagons and bring it back for us. And number 3, we're going to send a message. Don't do this, because this is what's going to happen to your town, because I want to destroy the town of Danbury. So this was the mission, and he gave it to Tryon and said, go take care of it. On the Patriot side, General David Wooster was the commander of all the Connecticut forces. He was based in New Haven, but he was in charge of all the Connecticut forces. Benedict Arnold, again, still on the Patriot side, he ran a pharmacy in New Haven. He was a pharmacist. And he was also, high-ranking and was often called upon to help out. Gold Silliman was the guy in charge of all of the militia in Fairfield County. And he lived in Fairfield, which was right near, of course, where they ultimately landed. So these are the key players who we'll be talking about. That's is the map that William Tryon used on this adventure. Now, we're not going to use that map for our discussions because it's a little too hard to follow, so we're going to use this one instead, which is, for me, a lot easier. But you'll see, basically, Route 58 up, Route 33 down. You know, a couple little side roads along the way, but that was the basic path. So we already know on Friday, he arrives late in the day. It's almost dusk, and they're getting all of these soldiers and wagons and provisions and everything off the main boats and coming inland. And that's obviously an artist's rendition of what it looked like. This is Compo Beach today. This is where the actual boats came in. You can go down and see it. It's a public beach, and it's worth the while. I would go down off season because the traffic's horrendous. And now we're gonna, this is one of my favorites, is the Captain Disbrow story. So they get into what is today Westport, and if you know downtown Westport, there is right at the corner of Church Lane and Myrtle Avenue, there's a church there, and you can see this little monument there, and it says that that used to be where Disbrow's Tavern was. Well, Captain Disbrow had a team of 17 guys, and they called it the Gallant 17. And of course, he's right there when the boats arrive, so he knows what's going on. This is the classic textbook case of the British used to march along in a single line in their red jackets, and the Patriots used to go and hide behind a stone wall and fire at them in hiding. This is what Disbrow's team did. They go and get into Stonewall area, and if you know the area, Green's Farm Road, or Green Farms Road, it was right around that area. So they're not even 2 miles inland before they're going to have their first interaction. So they're hiding behind the stone walls, and one of Disbrow's guys calls out, "Who goes there?" To which one of the British cavalierly responds, "You'll know soon enough." And with that, Disbrow's team opened fire. 3 British soldiers were badly wounded. So they had to stop everything 2 miles into this, what they thought was going to be red carpet rollout treatment. They have to stop, put these guys on wagons, take them back to their boats. So not inauspicious beginning to their weekend. They get to Weston, and for those of you who like to know these details, they were at that intersection, which is, trying to find out this exact route, by the way, is painstaking, so I put that up there in case it saves you some time. The next day, now Saturday, they're going to go up through Reading, Bethel, and Danbury. And in Reading, we're just going to spend a second here talking a little bit about this. So here's Route 58 again, Black Rock Turnpike, and Cross Highway, if you know it. I'm sure all of you from Ridgefield have been by there a million times. There was a church there, and it's still there. There was a graveyard there. It's still there. There was a tavern across the street, which is now a private home, but is still there. The field where they had lunch, 2,000 soldiers had lunch, is still there. And then there's a little tiny green. And there are 2 monuments. If you drive by there, you can get out and look at them, which I've done. I'm just going to show you one of the 2. You're not going to be able to read it, but I'll show it to you. And it talks about the 15 residents who were impacted that day. 14 of them were town regular residents, 2 of them selectmen. They were all taken as prisoners, and they were brought back eventually to the British ships, the prison ships that you may have heard about in New York City Harbor that were horrible. And many people died on them, and some of these 14 did as well. Others were bargained off for, a prisoner exchange or something like that. The 15th was a slave named Ned. And he will come back into this story just a little bit later. So now they go from Bethel to Danbury, and I should add now, it has started to rain. And it's raining a lot. It turns into a horribly wet day. Now this is Danbury. This map is from the 1800s. Not a lot of people living there. In the 1700s, obviously, it was even less. What you're looking at is Main Street in Danbury. This is South Street. This is White Street, if you know it. And there's a little sliver of land here that's called Elmwood Park. Today, it's right where the old courthouse was or is in Danbury. And that was the town green in Danbury. There were 2,500 residents, 400 dwellings. What you're going to find out is it's not like all of Danbury was burned. A lot of people make that mistake, and you'll find out why later it wasn't even worse. They only had 100 people in the militia defending the city. But they also had, aside from the supply depot area where they were making a lot of these items, they had the military hospital, which was in Danbury as well. So there was a lot of stuff that was important for the effort in Danbury. So they get into town, and Tryon needs to get headquarters where he's going to stay while this operation's underway. So he goes to Nehemiah Dibble's house. And you'll actually see a picture of Nehemiah Dibble's house a little bit later. He was a Tory, was happy to have Tryon there, and so that worked out very well for Tryon. On the northern end were going to be his two assistants, Agnew and Erskine, who were going to stay in a house owned by Benjamin Knapp. And then they would have sentries on the side roads, and they would cordon off Main Street. Now, again, they got there about 3 o'clock. Rain is either heavy or just drizzling, but it's raining. So their march up Main Street, most of the people, because there had been some word ahead of time, scouts had gotten up there, and the 100 militia were actually helping people get out of town because they were trying to save their lives. They were trying to save as much property as they could, and get stuff out of the way. So the militia was helping with that. But most of the residents had evacuated. The guy who ran the hospital took all the important stuff, put it on a wagon, went up to New Milford, and waited it out up there. The troops scattered to the hills. They realized it's 100 to 2,000. We're not going to just sacrifice ourselves. We'll live to fight another day, and we'll figure out how we can help best. By the courthouse at Elmwood Park, they start firing their cannons up Main Street to say, "Hi, we're here. And by the way, we mean business." Now, unfortunately, while they were there, they went by Ezra Starr's house. He was a captain in the militia. And what happened was there were 3 young men in Ezra Starr's house, and for some inexplicable reason, they opened fire on a 2,000-member British troop. One of them was Ezra Starr's son. One of them was this poor guy who had just come into town to get a jug of molasses. And this happened, and he just ducked into the house. And the third one, here's where Ned the slave comes back. So the 3 of them shoot on the British. Nobody got hit. There were no casualties. What was the British response? They savagely killed all 3 and then burned down the house. And they said, "This is what we do if you're going to behave that way." Even the Tories were ashamed that this happened. And this would be a constant theme throughout the weekend. So now up at Knapp's house, his poor wife is ill. She's an invalid. She's stuck in her bedroom, and so they commandeer the house, every room except hers, which you say, oh, okay, they've got a heart, that's nice. But then they go out and grab one of his cows, bring it into the living room, and slaughter it on the floor. And to the day that house was taken down, you could see the dent marks in the wood floor and the blood stains from the cow. Troops then found the rum. And this is going to be a very interesting part of the story because what happened, they got drunk. And they figured, well, we're off Sunday and no problem, we're gonna have a great time and we'll just have a fun tonight. So all the soldiers, it's this classic walking down Main Street with their arms around each other. There are diary, write-ups about this and just how rude these people were, singing and saying some pretty nasty things. So what are the Patriots doing? All right, so first of all, Gold Silliman was obviously the first one to know about this because he was right there in Fairfield. And so he rides up to Reading. Benedict Arnold finds out in New Haven. He joins along the way up to Reading and joins him and gets to Reading as well. And then Worcester brings his forces. They get to Reading. They all ride to Bethel together. They've got about 600 people. They're tired and they're wet. And not only are they wet, their gunpowder is wet. Now, the only point I would make here is they decided not to go into Danbury to take on the British that night because they were just exhausted. Their gunpowder was wet. It would, it would be folly to take them on. I wonder what would have happened had they known just how drunk the British soldiers were, whether that would have changed history. Because they may have gone in then, because even with wet gunpowder, they could have used bayonets and would have had an easy time of it. So Tryon now, he's not drinking, but he's becoming concerned because his troops are, number one. Number two, his scouts have come back and said, oh, by the way, there's 600 soldiers with top brass leading them right down the road 3 miles away in Bethel. And they were getting reports of farmers who were gathering in the hills around the city, and they were going to come in and help out. So Tryon makes a decision that it's ridiculous. I can't stay here Sunday, take off the day, and you know, go in Monday and do our work. We really have to get this done before then. So what he does is he gives orders to those who could still take them to mark all the Patriot leaders' houses with lime chalk, and then gives the order at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, start burning. So those houses where Patriot leaders of the militia were living, they definitely were burned. Then they went to all the places where there were items stored. Now, they originally, right, they were going to take all those items, put them on the wagons of people, and take them back to their ships. All the people had evacuated, and guess what? They used the wagons to take their stuff out of town. So there were no wagons for him to use. So he says, all right, if I can't do that, we're going to destroy the supplies. So they were burning everything, meat, they were burning uniforms, they were burning, you'll see a list in just a second. One of the famous stories from that Danbury night is that standing outside this particular store where they had been storing pigs, the fat ran ankle deep outside the store as it blazed, and these poor, you know, pigs, or what was left of them, came out, and the pork fat was ankle deep. So this is the list of items that was destroyed in Danbury. And it's pretty extensive. The two at the bottom are the two I would draw your attention to. The tents came from France. They weren't made here. So that was a big dent because it was going to take a long time to get more from France. And if you think about it, how did you communicate back then? The printing press was key. So without the printing press, that put a big dent in Danbury as well. So the British considered this, and I think all historians who are looking at it with, you know, straight eyes, this was a British victory. They did, you know, do a big dent into Danbury. Not as much as they wanted to, but they did a big dent. So now we come to the main event of the night, the Battle of Ridgefield. And this is just an incredible story when you look at what happened. So now they were going to go then on Sunday because they were no longer going to stay in Danbury. And what they end up doing is getting up about 4 o'clock in the morning. And in such a rush to get out of town, they can't go back to Bethel because there's 600 soldiers waiting for them there. So now they're going to go the back route and come through Ridgebury, down Route 116, come into Ridgefield, then go down 33. So they had 2 scouts, believe it or not, from Danbury who were helping them. And by the way, spoiler alert, at the end of the whole thing, the Danbury residents made those 2 people leave forever. They lost their property and everything else. They had to leave. But they were in such a rush, they never did get to the provision center or the hospital, so those 2 areas survived. Now, meanwhile, right over here is where all of the Patriot forces were, the 600 in Bethel. And they came up with a 2-part strategy. And you can see they're all going to go together this way, and then Worcester's going to take his men over here over Barlow Mountain, and Benedict Arnold and Gold Sullivan are going to come over here to downtown Ridgefield. And the idea is Worcester had 350 troops, and you'll say, wait a second, Mike, I thought they only had 600. Over the course of the evening, the word had gone out so far, they got another 150. So Worcester took 350 people to attack from the rear, and Arnold and Sullivan, of course, were going to go up front, and they had 400. So this was, 750 versus 2,000. Not great odds, but at least they can do something. It started with the bridge over Wolf Creek Run. How many people know where Wolf Creek Run is? Okay, so there's always one who does. Wolf Creek Run, that's it. You don't know it by Wolf Creek Run anymore. You know it by a different name. And what had happened was the farmers found out they were coming out through Ridgebury. So you know where George Washington Highway is, right? Well, George Washington Highway is right over here, just off the photo. And so the farmers came and removed the bridge. Said, okay, fine, let's see you get over this. So they got some fencing posts and put it across so they could try and get their wagons across this. But a lot of them couldn't make it, and so they had to drag all this stuff through the water, and cannons were getting mired down in this, and they finally got it across, and because of that, that was renamed, and that whole neighborhood is now called Miry Brook, because they got mired down. So the British now decide it's time for breakfast. You know, we're gonna take a break, and they had been going down Sherwood Road, which is off Ledges Road. You may not take this road very often. It's except for the blacktop and the telephone poles. I think this is pretty much what it looked like when the British came down, you know, in the day. So this is they took this road, and they were going to get up to Route 116, and they get there, and right at Takora Trail North is, of course, you've seen this church a million times. This is where they stopped and had breakfast. Of course, there was nothing there but the big field and the lake behind it, so they were very thrilled to be there, and this was good for them. What they didn't know was what was coming right after they finished breakfast. So now Worcester's men are crossing Barlow Mountain Road, they're having breakfast, and now it's time, you know, of course, Worcester's people go by their own water, right, and they have to go across to the Kiss River, but they get there, and now the British start marching, right? They're coming down this way, and this is Takora Trail, that little Half Moon Road there on the left. So they're right there, right at the intersection with Barlow Mountain Road and then Titicus Road North. The British finished eating. It was about 12 noon when they finished breakfast, if you can think about that. And it was a great surprise on the Patriots' part. And this is something that I think doesn't get enough attention. Not only, and this is, by the way, this is where it happened, right? So when you drive by this sign every time that says, you know, attack the rear guard, that's what it's saying. This is where this happened, right at the intersection there. So he took 40 prisoners because they weren't expecting this. Now, a lot of them were wounded because they put the wounded in the back of the parade, but they didn't have that many wounded at this point, but they did have some. So they got the wounded, they got some regulars, they got some Hessians. They also got a lot of their wagons and underscore ammunition. Because they didn't have enough ammunition anyway, Worcester captured a lot of the ammunition. The other thing that Worcester did, which I think is just funny as can be, is the supplies that they did manage to get out of Danbury, he stole them right back. So he took them back into the woods with the prisoners, and so that was engagement number one. So now the Patriots are feeling pretty good about themselves, right? These 350 people that are harassing the back end, and they decide they're going to continue doing this. So the British now basically are going from Takora Trail North to the southern terminus with Route 116. It's about a mile, and along that way they're harassing them, shooting, trading volleys back and forth. And finally the British have had enough of this, and they also have at the back of their column their cannons. So they turn the cannons around and aim them at Worcester's men and start firing. And they start firing along with, you know, guns and ammunition and whatnot. And when you think about Worcester's forces, yes, there were some regular militia, you know, who were semi-trained, nothing like the British who would, you know, war veterans. There were a lot of, you know, senior citizens who just had a musket coming off the farm, or teenagers who had a musket and were coming off the farm. You know, just people just trying to help out as best they could, but not really trained soldiers. So what ends up happening is they get to this point, this is where Takora Trail comes into 116, and right there's a little rise in the road, and next time you drive up there, hopefully you'll notice it a little bit more. It was right at the top of that rise where they turned the cannons around and aimed them back and started firing. Well, the young Patriots in particular got scared, and Worcester could see this. Worcester was 68 years old, and he was one of the most venerable Patriot soldiers and leaders that they had. So people looked up to him. So he gets on his horse and says, "Come on, boys, never mind such random shots." And with that, a British sharpshooter hits him in the side. He falls off his horse. And this is the point where he was mortally wounded. Now again, you drive by this every time you go on Route 116. This is the spot where he fell, and it's maintained by somebody. I don't know who maintains. Does anybody here know who actually maintains this and keeps it so nice looking? Is there anybody who can lay claim to that?
Mrs. Scott took care of that for a number of years. She lives right up the hill there, right on the property.
Thank you, Jack. I just want to do a quick footnote here. I do a lot of talks around the state and around the region, and when we talk about what towns do a really good job of keeping up their particularly Revolutionary War history, hands down, not even close, Ridgefield wins the award. So kudos to Ridgefield for what you do. Everything from naming the streets, everything from Rochambeau Drive to, you name it, Worcester Street, everything there, but just the care you take to this Keeler Museum, the Cannonball there, all that stuff, congratulations. So now, yeah, really, it's fabulous, and people recognize it, let me tell you. So they ended up having to use his own sash to carry him off. There was a medic there who did some preliminary looking at his wound and said, it's not good, we got to get him back to Danbury. So they put him on a wagon, took him back to Danbury. And at this point now, there's no leader for these 350, and it's unclear how many continued on to downtown Ridgefield to help out with Benedict Arnold and Gold Sloman. It's just not clear. But it almost doesn't matter at that point. But that was the second engagement. The third engagement is the one that everybody thinks is the Battle of Ridgefield, and you really have to take all three together. And so this is what I call the showdown on Main Street. So Benedict Arnold and Gold Silliman arrived in downtown Ridgefield before the British got there, and they were able to set up the famous barricade across Route 35. And the British come up now toward the downtown. And if you think about it from the British perspective, right, and this is the sign right outside Casagno, which, I lived there for a year back in the 1980s, hate to date myself, but back then I did not know all this history. I wish I had, because I would have come out every day and saluted the sign. I mean, this is just impressive. So this is what the British looked at. They also had to go across the Titicus River. They had to then go up by the old cemetery. They didn't have 116 there, or New Street, but they went up there. And then this is where you get 116 coming in with 35, and you see this little rise in the road. And strategically, that's important because you're coming up with cannons and other things that you have to now push uphill. And Benedict Arnold was smart. What he realized was, looking the other way, we have this little rise, and this is where he put the barricade. Was in between. There was a guy named Stebbins who had a big house in where Casagno is now, and probably many of you know that. And then over on the left, there was a rocky cliff. And so the barricade was built between these two to keep the British, at bay as best they could. And that's just another view, so you get a little even better view of the rise there. This is a depiction of what it looks like coming from downtown towards Stebbins. This is another depiction of what it would have looked like. And this is my favorite. This is why I have it on the entry slide. This is how I envision what it was like that day. And when you look at, the barricade and you look at the people, there was some very close-up fighting. Make no mistake about it. But the way it started was the British lobbing cannonballs at the barricade. And the fighting, somewhere between 30-60 minutes, nobody had a stopwatch, and one of the things that makes it difficult to estimate is after the barricade was finally breached, the fighting continued up Main Street. So on East Ridge and High Ridge, pot shots going back and forth, but the main battle was right there at the barricade. The odds, like I said, were not good for the Patriots, of course. They had put everything they could there. They got everything from the local homeowners that they could to build this barricade there. The British fired the cannons, and the important thing, I think, is, we'll get to this in just a second. The Patriots weren't moving off the barricade, so they said, we're going to go in around both sides. We're going to flank them, and we're going to come in that way. And then once we get them confused because they have to fight off our flankers, then we'll go through the barricade. Ultimately, that's what happened, and it worked. But this is the point. even with all the cannonballs, even with all the fire, the Patriots who were defending Ridgefield at the Battle of Ridgefield in this third engagement dug in their heels. And word of this spread throughout the colonies. This is the part that is underappreciated, is that the resolve that was shown that day, 247 years ago this coming Saturday, the resolve that was shown was that extra little momentum push. The players coming off the bench saying, let's do one, let's win one for Rocky. I mean, this is what it was about. And to me, this is the most important part of the Battle of Ridgefield. Now, Benedict Arnold was almost killed, and you may or may not know this story, but one of the flanks, the one on the Rocky side, they came around and they found Arnold there on his horse. And of course, the leaders were always on the horses, right? And so some people knew it was Benedict Arnold. And what happened was they were 10 yards away and they opened fire on him. Now, this either talks to the quality of guns or the marksmanship, whatever. None of those shots hit Benedict Arnold, but 8 of them hit his horse. And his horse went down, and it went down on his foot. Benedict Arnold had been severely injured at the Battle of Quebec a couple of years before this, or a couple of months before this. His operation to repair his knee, it was not that it was botched, it was just that his knee was so bad, there wasn't much they could do. So this horse fell on that same leg. So here he is, just writhing in pain, stuck with his foot, and what happens is, a British soldier comes up with a bayonet and says, guess what? You are my prisoner. And what did Benedict Arnold do? He said, not yet. He pulled out his pistol, he shot the guy, managed with, I'm sure, a lot of adrenaline to pull his foot out from underneath his horse, and went into the woods and gathered as many people as he could get from his forces and said, let's go fight another day. So now, and by the way, that happened at the intersection of Gilbert and Main Street. So next time you're down in that intersection, just think about Benedict Arnold there and what he did. Keeler Tavern, of course, I mean, what more can you say about that? From 247 years ago, the cannonball is still lodged in there, and it never ceases to amaze me every time I see it, just how really remarkable it is that that's been preserved and that even happened and that it's still there. But that's, of course, one of the things that happened that day. Here's where we are. Now, I don't know what happened to this sign. The sign post is out there, but not the actual sign. But you'll see it says, it was erected in 1740, partly burned by British soldiers during the Battle of Ridgefield. Well, the first church was built, before the Revolutionary War, of course, and as things got bad in 1776, it was, an Episcopal church, Church of England, and therefore Tory-oriented, and they basically said to Mr. Townsend, the minister, you are getting out of town. We don't want you here anymore, and they turned the church into a commissary for the Patriots. So the British, even though it was an Episcopal church, decided to send a message and set fire to it. It must have been one of the people who had been drinking in Danbury because they didn't do a very good job, and it was easily put out, so the church was used after that. And then the current one was built in 1914, still more than 100 years ago. So that happened there. The Congregational Church is where they were taking the wounded. There was fighting up on East Ridge and on High Ridge. On High Ridge, 4 or 5 houses were burned there along the way. So it's not as if all the fighting just occurred at the barricade. The British were going through and sending messages as they went. And this is, again, some of the Tories were outraged that this is the behavior they were exhibiting. So now it's time to bunk down for the night for the British. So first they have to, gather up all their wounded and whatnot and get to the corner of Route 33, Wilton Road, and Creamery Road, and this is where they spent the night. And it's, obviously the houses weren't there at the time, but it was a nice open field. That's where they stayed. Arnold, meanwhile, after getting his foot dislodged and getting his troops together, says, let's go down to Saugatuck, because he knew that for the British to get back to their boats, they were going to have to cross two rivers, the Norwalk River and the Saugatuck River. And he said, we are going to the Saugatuck River because there's only one bridge that goes across it. And we're going to wait for them there, and we're going to give it to them one more time. So the last stand at Saugatuck was a very simple concept. They were just going to go get up in the morning, go back and get to their ships. And the way they were going to do that, this is where they were staying up here at Creamery and Route 33. The main division was going to go right down Route 33. The backup was going to go the back roads through Whipstick and Nod Hill. They would meet up and go continue down Route 33 to downtown Wilton, and then get into what is today Westport. And Wilton, by the way, did not exist as a town then either. It was a parish of Norwalk. There they were going to go across the bridge and then down to their boats in Compo. So that was the plan, very simple, straightforward. Except that here's the bridge, and they get to the section in Wilton where routes 33 and 53 intersect, right? And that, is that area there of Chestnut Hill. And they get a message from their scouts, oh, by the way, Benedict Arnold and his people are waiting for you on the hill overlooking the bridge, and it's called Old Hill. And you can drive up Old Hill Road right off of the road there and see exactly where they were staying. So now they have to make a decision, what are we going to do? And one of the scouts said, I got an idea. You don't actually need to use that bridge. There's a spot in the Saugatuck River where there's a bend in the river, it slows down and is very shallow, we can ford the river. So the British are going to pull a fast one on Benedict Arnold and not go by him and not use the bridge. And so what that meant was, so Benedict Arnold's down here, they get here, they're not going to do this, and instead they're going to do this. They're going to ford the river and go down. So this is exits 41 and 42 of the Merritt Parkway. You're probably familiar with them. You've probably had plenty of time sitting in traffic jams to admire both. So if you look at exit 41, there's a road called Red Coat Road. And that is the road that they went down. That's one of the reasons I think they still call it Red Coat Road. So that takes you right there, and you can drive that. It's public. You can go right over there and see exactly where they went across the Saugatuck River, which is where they did it. And notice it's called Ford Road over there. And then they went down from there. So that's how they did it. This is where they crossed. Now, just to set up the end, I'm going to tell you that just to the right on this photo, out of sight, is a plaque that I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation. And when we get to that, to me, it is the epitome of why the Battle of Ridgefield was so important and the message it sent. And I would encourage you to drive down there and see it for yourself and just stand there and recognize really what this was all about. So the final skirmish, Patriots realize, oops, we've been duped. So they go across the bridge, the Saugatuck River Bridge, and they're going to, get up with the British there. Well, again, the British are basically out of ammunition. And it's a 3-hour fight. And what they end up having to do is put the bayonets on their muskets and charge at the line, and that's what happened. They broke the line, and they got back to their ships and were able to go on then back to New York City. That ends the weekend of the British coming through. What I want to do is talk about a few sort of other points, side points. First of all, what happened to Mr. Worcester? I told you you'd see a picture of Nehemiah Dibble's house. This was the only photo that exists of Nehemiah Dibble's house. It was taken before it was ripped down. This is where Tryon stayed, and you might say, well, why would they put poor Worcester in a Tory house? Well, they had burned down all the Patriot houses. So this was the best house they had to take him to. They brought up a doctor from New Haven because the wound was so bad they figured they needed a specialist. He looked at it and said, look, the spinal cord's been hit, it's lodged in there, it's just a matter of time, unfortunately. So he died 5 days later. And there were only 6 men who went to his funeral, and they were the pallbearers because Danbury was so badly destroyed that all the able-bodied men were fixing up the city. So only 6 pallbearers at General Worcester's funeral. What do we have to remind ourselves of this weekend? Well, obviously, the Ridgefield contingent is doing their job. This is, all these signs, this is what these signs mean, and I hope maybe they mean a little bit more to you tonight after seeing exactly how they fit together. The Keeler Tavern, example is just incredible. Worcester was buried originally in a small cemetery off Main Street in Danbury, off what's called Worcester Street. 75 years to the day after he died, he was reinterred into a new cemetery by Danbury Hospital, which you've probably seen if you've been to the hospital. There's a cemetery there. That is Worcester Cemetery. And this is the monolith gravestone for him, and this is where the depiction of him getting shot comes from, is that relief on the headstone. This house, which you may have driven by if you've ever driven down Main Street in Danbury from exit 5 down to downtown, that house there is the only house remaining on Main Street that was there on the night in 1777 when the city was burned. So it probably belonged to a Tory. It's now a private rooming house, which drives me crazy every day. I keep hoping the city or somebody will buy it and that we can preserve it for sure, but this is the last house there. Sybil Ludington, you notice I didn't mention anything about Sybil Ludington. This is a very sort of hot potato topic, but let me tell you what I know about it, and I'm not an expert, but this is what I know about it. Sybil Ludington supposedly was the Paul Revere of that night when Danbury got burned. Her dad was the general in charge of the Patriot forces in Dutchess County and Putnam County. Supposedly, in the driving rain, this 16-year-old girl got on a horse and rode around to all the farms and said, "Go to Danbury's aid, help her, help Danbury out." And indeed, a lot of farmers did go and help Danbury out. The problem is that, and historians look for contemporaneous information that says, this happened then, like a newspaper article or something. The story about Sybil Ludington comes from her dad's diary. After he died, his children tried to get it published. No publisher would do it, so they self-published it. That's where the story comes from. So and there was a lot of local contemporaneous stuff written, and you would think a 16-year-old girl riding around on horseback doing this would have made news somewhere, but it didn't. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I have no idea, but I'm just letting you know the full story. This statue is in the outside plaza area of Danbury Library. There is the Minuteman statue in Westport, a half mile from Compo Beach, that was done by an artist trying to do a rendering of patriots in general, nobody in particular. Unfortunately, Compo Hill, where the actual battle took place, is up in this neighborhood over here. It's private, and there's all sorts of penalties for driving up even the road, so I would not encourage you to try and do that. Weekend impacts, 2 ways to look at it. Number 1 is tactical. Technically, the British took more casualties than the Patriots did. The Danbury supplies, no question about it, they were destroyed. The Ridgefield battle did such a good job at depleting the ammunition that it stretched the Saugatuck skirmish, or whatever you want to call it, because the British weren't expecting all this and they were running out. Worcester, of course, was killed. That was the end of his career, no longer available to help out in the war. And many houses were burned, more in Danbury than Ridgefield, but in both towns they were. This is where I think, though, is more important, is the morale question. And this is the momentum issue again. So when you think about the fact that, the British had been kicked out of Boston, then they come down and take New York, then Washington comes around and takes Trenton and Princeton, the war could have gone either way. This is 2 years into the war. In fact, almost exactly the same month, 2 years after Lexington and Concord. And the resolve that was shown and the obvious pride on the part of patriots was unmistakable after the Battle of Ridgefield. The other thing that was critically important was the absolute revulsion that Tories and Patriots alike felt for how the British handled it. And Tryon, I'm sure was behind a lot of this. But the sentiment went in favor of the Patriots after this. And right here at the Battle of Ridgefield, there was a guy named Coe, Captain Coe, and he was on the right flank. He got shot in the head, bayoneted, robbed. He survived and told the story, and people were appalled. They were killing wounded soldiers instead of taking them prisoner. That was not supposed to be done, but they were doing it. And of course, the 3 kids that were killed in Danbury left a real sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. So while history records this weekend as a victory for the British because of what they did in Danbury, make no mistake about it, the morale shift really went to the Patriots. And it could have gone the other way, and one wonders whether we might be having tea at 4 o'clock now instead of doing what we're doing. Here's the plaque that's by the water that I wanted to just quickly show you. British troops forged the river here on April 28, 1777 on their return from raiding Danbury, never to invade inland Connecticut again. And that is the lesson they learned, was don't mess with us inside of Connecticut. So with that, I thank you for your attention and your time. I do have one more thing, and I don't know if the person is here who contacted or left a message on social media saying, gee, I hope he talks about the Liberty Pole in Ridgefield. Now, I didn't know anything about the Liberty Pole in Ridgefield. First I heard about it, but I did put this together one slide just real quickly. The Liberty Pole, and a lot of towns had Liberty Poles that they put up during the Revolutionary War, right at the beginning of it usually. And the town green was, of course, now where Jesse Lee Methodist Church is. That was the town green in Ridgefield at the time, and the Liberty Pole was erected there. It was made out of a buttonwood tree trunk that came from near Market Street, and right at that point is where the town's whipping post was, by the way, just in case you weren't aware. And, you know, this is where protests were held and placards were put up and those sorts of things. So that's what was there. I have no idea what happened to the Liberty Pole after that. Also, just shameless self-promotion. Hopefully you saw my cards there. This is the podcast. This is actually the debut night for my brand new cards, because on the back of it you'll see a QR code, and all you have to do is put your camera up against that on your phone, and you can go right to my website and hear my 140 episodes. So with that, thank you again for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Not sure they're, but what the interest would be. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you make this presentation available on your website?
I don't traditionally do that for a whole host of reasons, but I think this was being filmed tonight. So maybe Stephen would have, if you contact the Ridgefield Historical Society. Stephen, is that going to be on your website, or you just have this in your archives? Or?
Yes, we'll post it on our YouTube channel.
YouTube channel, okay?
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Just a note, I'm a volunteer with the Ridgefield Historical Society, and I've been assigned to look at the pension records and try to call any information from the pension records related to the Battle of Ridgefield. And I came across this one. I almost started crying. It was a graphic description of the barricade battle. It's Samuel Seeley's pension record. So Samuel Seeley is at the barricade, and they notice that about 40 yards in front of them, the British are going east and west, as you described, to flank the barricade. And so the Patriots see this, and so they're ordered to retreat, otherwise they're going to be surrounded. So in this engagement, Samuel Seeley is wounded in the hip and in the knee. He is unable to move. He's on the ground. He can crawl barely. And the British come across him. They bayonet him 14 times. and quote unquote, they blew his brains out. And I was stunned at the vicious nature of the battle at the barricade. I never really, put it together until I read that graphic description. It was quite humbling, to say the least.
You've exactly encapsulated why so many people were so upset with the British that the momentum started to turn. There were a lot of Tories in Ridgefield, and there were a lot of Tories in Newtown. Newtown was a huge Tory center. Even they were upset when word started to filter out as to what had happened. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I try not to get too graphic in these discussions because I don't know the audience tolerance, but you're absolutely right. I mean, war is hell, as we know, but this was particularly bad. Yeah.
And there was one other story that I think is appropriate, especially with your presentation. I could never figure out how Benedict Arnold, who almost died at the Battle of Ridgefield, was able to hightail it out of here and get to Ridgefield and organize a defensive action at the Saugatuck River Bridge. He didn't have a horse. The horse was shot 8 or 9 times. So how did he get out of here? And so the pension record of a fellow named Walter Whitney, he was a witness. He was about 8 to 10 rods, which is about 40 yards away. He was over by the Gilbert house on the west side of Main Street coming in, right near the ledges there. And he saw a quote-unquote enemy horseman approach Arnold, threaten him, and he said Arnold took out his pistol and shot him dead. One shot, dead. Enemy horseman. So I contacted Keith Jones, who is our expert on this battle, and I said, enemy horseman, so was that British dragoon cavalry? He said, well, I've got the casualty records from the British dragoons, and they had no casualties. So highly unlikely that it was a British dragoon. So Keith's estimation was it was a Tory horseman, cavalry, but I don't know if they didn't call it cavalry. But anyway, in the pension record, Whitney says, and Arnold mounted this fellow's horse, who he just shot and killed, and effected a retreat. And so that's how he got the hell out of here. I mean, he got south in a hurry to help organize the troops at the Saugatuck River Bridge. I was blown away by that too. I mean,
it's fascinating because he also had help when he got further south because they had then cannons that were up
Correct.
on Old Hill, ready for the British, who of course then never went by.
right.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
One thing you didn't mention, but which adds to your thesis, is that Arnold was in the process of resigning his commission, and the Battle of Ridgefield kept him in the war, meaning he was available for the Battle of Saratoga later in the year, which he played a key role in. So that really adds to your thesis, I think.
Well, and also it was his performance here that added to his anger at not getting promoted. So he was not really good at lobbying Congress, as a lot of others were that were not his equal on the battlefield. But he had kind of a temper. And, if you know his life growing up, he had a horribly sad life growing up. His dad was a drunk, and there was just a lot of trouble for him. But nevertheless, it was his anger at not getting promoted. That's why Washington, who felt bad for him because he knew the job he was doing, gave him West Point and said, here, take West Point and do that. Your knee's bad. I don't want you on the battlefield, but take West Point. And then he makes his deal to give up West Point to the British, and that's when everything, went south. But you're absolutely right. He was in the process of doing that, and it kind of gave him new reason to be, right? I mean, he was like, yeah, I like this, and he did go on to, like you say, Saratoga. But it was, it was bad. It was bad. His knee was in horrible shape. And what I don't understand, reading the description of how bad his knee was, I don't even know how he got to Ridgefield. I mean, even riding a horse, I don't know how he did it, how he could stand up. It was just horrible what happened.
Further damage at Saratoga, I think.
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Well, that's where the boot is, right?
Yeah.
You know. His boot hangs there without any name on the boot. But, you know. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know how many Tories versus Patriots there were in Ridgefield at the time?
The best number I have is 2,000 to about 600. And the reason why the Patriot number is so loose is we know that 400 started off with Benedict Arnold and Gold Silliman, and we know that some of Worcester's troops managed to get around somehow into downtown Ridgefield, get around the British and get there. How many, we don't know, but in my best guess, I think it's about 600. And keep in mind, it wasn't as organized as it's not like we had Excel spreadsheets with everybody's name and serial number and everything. So they ended up having people just showing up because the word had gone out and people were getting there as quickly as they could. There's a famous story of, I wish I could remember his name, I think he was 76 years old. And he came from, I want to say Litchfield, somewhere around there. He rode all the way down and he was a sharpshooter. He was well known in Litchfield. And he was picking off British soldiers as they were marching down 33 through Wilton to the point where Tryon ordered an entire detachment to go after him. He was that, but there were people like this just showing up all over the place. So exact numbers, no, it's impossible. Sorry. Okay?
Thanks.
All right, thank you.